Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of Part of the Problem. I am Dave Smith, and today I am thrilled to welcome back to the show the great Dave DeCamp, who, of course, is the news editor over at antiwar.com, and he's also the host of Anti-War Radio is the name of the show. Is that right?
Anti-War News is the
Anti-War News. I'm sorry, Anti-War News. So somebody, Dave, as I've said both to you and behind your back, publicly and privately, somebody who has been a tremendous resource for me over the years. If you go to antiwar.com, as I do every day, Dave is always writing something, just about every day, it seems, multiple things most days, to just kind of keep you up to pace with the latest of what's going on in foreign wars. And very, fortunately for you, it's been business has been busy. So you have not, if you had the concern that you were going to be put out of business because there just wouldn't be too many foreign wars going on, that problem you don't have to worry about. But anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to join us once again. How are you?
I'm good, Dave. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be speaking with the leader of the woke right.
That's right. It wasn't a job I was applying for, but sometimes they just find you. But yes, of course. Well, you're a valuable member of this woke right. This we have these wild woke views, like, don't go on government mass murder sprees unless you really have to, which is it's basically critical race theory right there. So you had pitched me on the idea, which I very quickly jumped on, but that we should do an episode really kind of, talking about what's been going on in Yemen, in Trump's campaign against the Houthis there. You had made the point just off air before we started here that it really is kind of amazing how little attention this conflict is getting. It's like it feels like only if you live in the United States of America or Israel, perhaps, is it just kind of like a normal thing to go on bombing campaigns. It's not even like big news. You'd think for most countries, that'd be like a really big deal if you started dropping bombs on another country. For us, it seems to be very run of the mill.
Yeah. And what's been happening in Yemen over the past month, for about a month and a half now, has been some of the heaviest bombing that we've seen in the country over the past, 10 years. And this is a country, I really liked your post when Trump started this bombing campaign again, because you said something that I thought was great, that the good news is there is a diplomatic solution, a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, that's what this is all over. But as we know, the U.S. has been bombing Yemen heavily for a long time, really starting in 2009 with Obama's drone wars. I believe the first U.S. airstrike was launched in Yemen under George W. Bush, but Obama really ramped things up against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And these were, when people talk about Obama's drone wars and the extrajudicial killings and bombing weddings, a lot of it is Yemen. A lot of the most horrific atrocities committed by Obama went down in Yemen. And then in 2015, that was when the Saudis, the UAE, and other Arab countries formed this coalition to go after the Houthis, who are officially known as Ansar Allah. They took over the capital, and the U.S. backed them in this war, even though a few months earlier, as Scott Horton always likes to point out, the U.S. was cooperating with the Houthis against Al-Qaeda. This is a familiar pattern that we see around the region, especially in Syria, where we end up siding with Al-Qaeda. So, the background there is from 2015 to 2022 about the U.S. backed a horrifically brutal war, bombing campaign, ground campaign, blockade, on scale with the barbarity that we've seen in Gaza. And this went on throughout the whole first Trump administration. I know it's an issue you've been very good on and talked about a lot. I remember there was a clip, you went on Joe Rogan, and the clip they put on YouTube was you talking about this history that I'm talking about now. So I know you're aware of this. Most of your viewers are, like, what we're dealing with here, all this context, but most people just aren't. So then when Trump starts bombing them again, and they say, oh, it's to protect shipping lanes, and everybody kind of falls in line. And I mean, I even see libertarians saying, well, we got to protect the shipping lanes. Isn't that the purpose of the U.S. Navy? And so, like, the other important historical context here for what's happening now is that after October 7th, after Israel unleashed its brutal bombing campaign on Gaza, the Houthis started targeting Israeli shipping, essentially declaring like a blockade on Israeli shipping in the Red Sea. And in January 2024, President Biden launched a new bombing campaign in Yemen against the Houthis with the UK. And as I predicted at the time, and it wasn't very hard for me to predict, anybody who knew anything about Yemen and the Houthis knew that like a limited bombing campaign isn't going to stop them. If anything, it's going to embolden them and rally their supporters around them. They're trying to make a name for themselves as like the only Arabs really standing up for the Palestinians. And so after a year of that, nothing stopped the attacks. In fact, they expanded their attacks to start targeting American and British shipping. And then after a year, they did stop their attacks. Well, what got them to stop was a ceasefire in Gaza on January 19th. They stopped. And in early March, when Israel imposed a total blockade on Gaza, not letting any food in, which they're still, that's still in effect, complete violation of the ceasefire deal, the Houthis announced that they're going to reimpose their blockade on Israeli shipping. And just a few days later, the Trump administration unleashes this really, heavy bombing campaign, much heavier than what Biden was doing. And again, they're doing this instead of just making Israel implement that ceasefire deal that it signed in January, instead of just, cutting off the aid to Israel. I mean, that's the key here to the regional calm. So, I mean, that's, again, the important context here. So when we see people say, oh, they got to stop attacking U.S. ships. Actually, the Houthis, a senior member of the Ansar Allah political bureau, told Dropsite News that they would be willing to agree to a ceasefire with the U.S. We'll stop attacking your warships if you stop bombing Yemen. I tried to get the State Department, the Pentagon, the National Security Council to answer that. Would you consider a deal like that? And I never heard back. And they do actually usually get back to me. So, I mean, this is just the reality. Hegseth and Trump say if the Houthis stop targeting American ships, we'll stop bombing Yemen. Well, here they are saying we will stop. But they're also saying they're going to continue the blockade on Israel. And that's what this is really about.
Yeah. Well, so it's like, I really think that, the point that I've tried to make about this, like more recently, when you mentioned, me talking about this on Joe Rogan's podcast a few years ago, I mean, the point I was making at the time was like, we should stop doing this. Like it was still going on. And I was like, we should stop doing this. This is horrible. I mean, it's just like, horrifically immoral to bring this type of destruction on the poorest country in the Middle East for no strategic reason other than what Obama officials stated, that it was like, oh, this helps our relationship with the Saudis or something like that, which is, insane. But I think today when we bring it up, it's more important to understand the point that you were making in there, that this is not going to defeat the Houthis. I mean, I'm sure you're kind of like me in this, that when you first saw the Houthis enter this fight, when they made it clear that they were going to stick up for the Palestinians, there is part of you that's like, oh God, no, because Jesus, like the people of Yemen have just been through so much, and one way or the other, whether it's justified or not, this is going to bring even more, destruction toward Yemen. But the point is that if they made it through the 7 or 8 years of a Saudi invasion, a total blockade, these massive bombing campaigns, they made it through. I mean, it was what was considered by the UN and many other humanitarian organizations to be the worst humanitarian crisis in the world through all of those years. And that didn't unseat the Houthis. Then it's just a joke to think that launching a few tomahawks is going to like get them to wave the white flag. And so you have, on one hand, very clearly there is not a military solution short of another war in Iraq. Like, I think certainly if the U.S. wanted to invade Yemen, we could overthrow the Houthis. As we learned from all these terror wars, we'd probably have other problems to deal with, insurgencies and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, if we want to go spend another $3 trillion and lose another, few thousand U.S. soldiers and maybe have 10 or 20,000 more commit suicide in the aftermath, okay, we could do that. That's one option. The other option would be the ceasefire that, I mean, you just can't overstate this, that Trump's envoy negotiated or at least got done. I guess it was basically the same ceasefire that had been kicked around for quite a bit, but it just seems so obvious, like, not that it's like, oh, look, why, if it was any other country and Trump's envoy Witkoff here was able to work out this ceasefire, and then one country started violating it and it causes more problems for us that they're not living up to, it'd just be so obvious what the answer is here. It's only because it's Israel that this is even the conversation goes to like, well, then I guess we got to fight this war for them.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, as you mentioned, the Trump administration, they took this as a big victory in the first few weeks that they got this ceasefire.
Right.
And now Israel's completely abrogated that deal. And we see this daily slaughter happening every day, and they're literally starving children now. I mean, there's no debating that they're not using starvation as a weapon of war now, that they haven't let any food in almost 2 months. And what we've seen in Yemen, so you mentioned during the Saudi war, the Houthis survived that. They didn't just survive it. They actually got better at fighting. And the thing that really made the Saudis and the UAE sue for peace was the fact that Houthi missile and drones started hitting oil fields and oil infrastructure deep inside Saudi Arabia and in the UAE. They hit some targets there as well. And we're seeing a familiar pattern here in the U.S. bombing campaign just in recent weeks. The Houthis have shot down 7 U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drones, which are these big drones that are used for surveillance that can be used to launch airstrikes. And they've downed a total of 21 of these drones since October 2023, but 7 just in recent weeks. And U.S. officials have been telling the media that they're actually getting better at targeting them. And the U.S. also just lost an F-18 overboard off an aircraft carrier that apparently the aircraft carrier, the Harry Truman, had to make a hard turn to avoid a Houthi attack. So, U.S. warships have incredibly advanced air defense systems, but it almost seems like, it's only a matter of time before a Houthi drone makes it through, and then we might see some American casualties. And then what happens? So it seems like in response to this, these airstrikes not working, they're just ramping them up. The U.S. military, or the Pentagon, put out this press release on the first 100 days of the Trump administration, and somehow they were bragging about bombing Yemen. They said that they struck more than 1,000 targets in Yemen in just again, like a month and a half, a little less than that. And they've killed hundreds of civilians. These have been, some of the most brutal airstrikes we've seen in Yemen. On April 17th, the U.S. bombed a fuel port in Hodeidah, the Red Sea province, and killed, according to the Yemen Data Project, which tracks this stuff, killed 80 civilians. And this is mostly port workers. I mean, this is a massacre on a huge scale. And barely anyone has noticed, in the U.S. at least. Obviously, people in Yemen are very aware. And there's also, just the other day, on Monday, they bombed a migrant detention facility in northern Yemen and killed 68 people. And it looks like they're all African migrants. And the real, why would the U.S. bomb this facility? I don't think the U.S. would intentionally slaughter a bunch of African migrants. But how bad is their intelligence that they would bomb this? The really kind of egregious thing about it is that the Saudis bombed the same place 3 years ago, in January 2022, right before the ceasefire between the Houthis and the Saudis. As I understand it, it was a different building, but it's like the same facility. And the Saudis killed 91 civilians in that strike, 91 African migrants. 3 years later, the U.S. bombs the same place. And they claim, oh, we're having incredible success. We're killing all these Houthi fighters and taking care of their air defenses and everything. But I mean, it's just, they have no way of knowing that. They don't really have, they don't have people on the ground. I saw at one point a statement from the CENTCOM spokesman said something like, oh, we've killed hundreds of their militants, based on open source reporting. Well, open source reporting means it's just what you could find on the internet. I mean, it goes to show they just don't know what they're bombing, and their solution is just bomb away. So yeah, it's really criminal what's happening here. It's completely unauthorized. This is an important point here, because you see people justifying it, saying, oh, the War Powers Act lets the president, engage in military action for 2 months if there's an imminent, under an emergency, if there's an imminent threat. Well, that signal chat showed us that there was no imminent threat. They were saying, J.D. Vance said, hey, maybe we should put these plans on the shelf for about a month, work on the messaging. And Pete Hegseth, who was, wanted to do it right away, even said that if, you wanted a pause, we could pause it. And, and he was the one arguing in favor of doing it. So that shows there was no imminent threat. So it's completely illegal. It's immoral. It's failing. And it's only being done to ensure Israel can keep killing Palestinians in Gaza. So this is really just, I think, one of the worst things happening right now under this new Trump administration.
Sorry, I don't mean to smirk as you say that, but there was something in that just seemed like almost what should be the tagline for US foreign policy. It describes all of it. It's illegal, it's immoral, it's not working, and it's only being done for Israel. That seems to kind of describe every military action that I can remember over the last 25 years. And you know, it's wildly frustrating that really, I mean, the only reason anyone's even talking about this on a when I say anyone, obviously there are people who care about this, but broadly speaking, amongst the American, you know, conversation, is because of this Signal Gate thing. And like, still, it seems like the story there, the scandal is just that this Atlantic hack journalist happened to be added to the Signal chat. And I've been saying from the beginning that exactly your point. The real scandal here was that portion of the chat where JD Vance offers the most impotent pushback, but I guess I should give him credit for being the only one who seemed to offer any pushback, where he does kind of say, I think we're making a mistake. I think this is everything against what we ran on, but then goes, I mean, hey, I'm totally on board if you guys want to do it. But then Heggs, right? You said Heggs, Seth, in response to him goes, I get your point. You know, I get what you're saying. And look, this isn't time sensitive. We don't have to do this right now. And so, in other words, right, the War Powers Act, and I think Rothbard had a piece on this where it was like, look, the War Powers Act was horrible because it basically just gave the president the authority for 2 months or 90 days or whatever it gives you to start a war, you know, and it's like it was already in the Constitution that you need the Congress, so we shouldn't have even added that. But even within the War Powers Act, it's like, yes, the threat has to be imminent. And so, no, you don't. If you have the option to seek congressional approval, you don't have the right to just launch military operations. But like, it's crazy that never even comes up as a thought. Nobody even thinks to themselves, oh, well, if we don't have to do this right away, then we have to go to Congress and get approval for this. Just not even a thought anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's a big risk here when, you know, we talk about the potential for war with Iran. Like, it's not like they're going to have to do this big media thing like they did with Iraq and this build up to like get the public on board. They could just bomb Iran. I mean, like, that's just the way that the executive branch operates now. So yeah, I mean, this is something when it comes to Yemen that I think you know, we've seen some like very mild pushback from some members of the Senate. I know Rand Paul joined a letter questioning the authorization, and there was another letter from like 3 Senate Democrats about the civilian casualties, but they didn't even say, like, challenge the fact that the U.S. was bombing Yemen. They were basically just saying you should try to limit civilian casualties. So yeah, I mean, the sad truth is that if they did go to Congress, they would get the approval, but still, it is still illegal what they're doing right now in Yemen. And the next possible escalation is backing a ground offensive against the Houthis, which would essentially be restarting the war that the Saudis failed at. You know, there's these factions on the ground saying that they have like 80,000 fighters or something, but I don't even think that would be enough, because if you've seen what's happening in Yemen, you know, the Houthi leader has been calling for these rallies. And I mean, these pictures from the capital, like it looks like hundreds of thousands of people come out, and a lot of them have AK-47s. Like, this is, again, you know, really emboldening the Houthis and making them this kind of resistance faction that they really want to be. So if we continue down this path of escalation, I mean, it's just going to be just such a disaster. And but again, it just doesn't seem like anybody's learning this lesson in the administration, even though one of the best arguments against bombing Yemen when Biden started doing it was written by Mike Domino, who right now is the head of Middle East policy in the Pentagon. So unfortunately, it looks like, you know, his views are not winning the day, even though right now we still haven't had a strike on Iran. I think that risk is pretty high. And, you know, it's just a shame that a guy like Domino doesn't seem to be steering the policy.
Well, or how about a guy like Donald Trump? I mean, Donald Trump said, I'm sure you've seen the clip, but when Tim Pool had him on, He did get this amazing soundbite out of Donald Trump, and it was right after Joe Biden had just bombed Yemen for the same reason. And Donald Trump went off on how stupid this was and how, oh, this is all these guys ever want to do is drop a bomb on someone rather than pick up the phone call and pursue diplomacy, and this whole lecture. And man, we could use a guy like that to be president right now, because it just seems like so obvious. But, look, it just seems to me, and I know that sometimes, it's funny because sometimes speaking of Tim Pool, like the Tim Pools of the world will say there's of the Trump kind of broad coalition, right? There's like the people who are like total Zionists, want to support Israel. There's the people who are, huge critics of Israel. And then there's kind of the people in the middle or whatever. And people like Tim Pool will say like, oh, why are you guys so obsessed with Israel? Like, why are you just always talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I mean, what are you talking about? What's going on in sub-Saharan Africa right now, or in Southeast Asia, or in where, why do you care so much about this conflict? But it's like, aside from it just being like something horrific is being done with my tax dollars, it's really this. It's like, this is really what it's about. It's like, now because we support Israel, we have to now be drawn into yet another war in the Middle East, with an even larger war looming behind it, which it seems like there's this huge effort to get us into. And like, this is the whole issue. It's not just like Israel can do this to the Palestinians with American money, and that's it. It's like, oh, this also requires us constantly being at war with other Arab states or other Muslim states as a result of it. And this is what we're opposing here. Hey guys, as I always say, if you want to change the world, start with your own behaviors. And here's an easy one. Stop drinking garbage coffee from those giant corporations and switch to Blackout Coffee. Blackout Coffee is roasted right here in the United States of America by people who believe in liberty just like you. They do all the roasting, packing, and shipping in-house. There's no middleman. There's a reason they have over 25,000 five-star reviews, because the coffee is excellent. I've tried their coffee. I love it, and I'm a bit of a coffee snob, so take my word for it. This is quality coffee. You're going to love it too. So right now, go to blackoutcoffee.com/problem and use the promo code problem, and you're going to get 20% off your order. Again, that's blackoutcoffee.com/problem, promo code problem for 20% off your first order. Support your values, support freedom, and get some coffee that doesn't suck. blackoutcoffee.com/problem, promo code problem for 20% off your first order. All right, let's get back into the show.
Yeah, and when Biden was in 2023, when this all, popped off, the U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria came under like constant like rocket and drone attack, because the U.S. was supporting what Israel's doing in Gaza, and it culminated in 3 U.S. Army soldiers being killed in a drone attack. So, this is very much the reason for why the U.S. keeps these bases in Iraq and Syria. I mean, there's been all these reports recently about the Trump administration. They're drawing down troops in Syria. Initial reports said they might pull out, but who was arguing against it? It was Israel. Israel wants the U.S. to stay. Now it's under the pretext of keeping Turkey out of certain areas. After they got rid of Assad, Iran's ally, now they're saying that the new government, they're justifying invading southern Syria and occupying it and bombing it. So yeah, I mean, this is the key kind of to everything, especially today. Like again, with Yemen, this is just so obvious. It's more in your face with the situation in Yemen. I remember there was a report from Ynet, Israeli media, so after the U.S. started bombing Yemen on March 15th, and they also preempted Israel completely breaking the ceasefire. It was March 15th that the U.S. first launched the airstrikes on Yemen, and it was March 18th that Israel completely ended the ceasefire and killed like 470 Palestinians in the first 24 hours. Including like a lot of kids, like nearly 200 children. And so you look at the timeline, and after that March 18th, when they started bombing Gaza again, then the Houthis started firing missiles at Israel again, kind of separate from them declaring a blockade. Now they're shooting missiles and drones at Israel. And there's a report on Ynet that said the U.S. told Israel, "Don't worry about these attacks. You guys don't need to respond. We'll take care of it." Because Israel did bomb Yemen, I believe, 2 or 3 times last year in response to these attacks. But so it is just blatantly in your face about this bombing campaign in Yemen is about Israel. Of course, there's other factors, including just the profit, the military industrial complex. Sure. That's always a factor. But this is very just so clearly about just ensuring Israel can continue to do whatever it wants. And it's really shameful. I mean, again, I mentioned the blockade. Like, Trump has the ability to get on the phone and say, let the aid into Gaza, or I'm going to cut you off. And every day he doesn't do that. I mean, it's just really shameful.
Yeah, and it seems like at least in when we'll see how that develops, but at least like in Ukraine, Trump is certainly willing to say like, hey, look, if you want our support and you're relying on us, then okay, but we have some expectations, we have some boundaries and conditions that come along with that. And yet it almost never seems to be the case with the U.S. relationship with Israel. And to your point, this is something I've kind of been hitting on a lot lately, but I find this to be an interesting dynamic. But like, okay, if like what I know now, what you probably know better than I know, but like if you know about the war in Iraq and you really know, like, okay, you could go read through like the Project for a New American Century, or you can read the Clean Break memo, or you can read Netanyahu's old writings or whatever. And you could see that like, okay, the Likudniks in Israel and the neoconservatives, their counterpart in the United States of America, they wanted to overthrow Saddam Hussein since at least the 90s. Okay. And they were very upset that they didn't overthrow him in the first Gulf War. And they wanted to have plans to overthrow him all throughout the 90s and well before 9/11. However, that was not, first off, there weren't podcasts and there wasn't social media and there were, there were newsletters and stuff like that. But this was not something that was widely known. It probably was widely known within connected people in DC, but it wasn't widely known by the American people. And the propaganda, at least for going into Iraq, was no, it had nothing to do with that. This has nothing to do with Israel. This was about 9/11. This was about nuclear weapons and the fact that Saddam Hussein was in on 9/11 and now he has nukes. So he's friends with these terrorists. They could end up getting a nuke and nuking the United States of America. So there was at least, there was some good old-fashioned propaganda there where Joe Sixpack in America could very reasonably, seeing what was said on the TV, say to his friend, well, we got to go see about these nuclear weapons. I mean, we can't let that, we can't let that go. But there just simply is no propaganda like this with the Houthis. Nobody is even attempting to make the argument that aside from the fact that they could be a problem for some of our ships, where as I can't remember, was it JD Vance or Pete Hegseth, or I think both of them acknowledged on the Signal chat, like a very small percentage of our trade even depends on any of this, but like that's the best they got. It's just so obvious that this is about the conflict in Gaza. However you feel about it, that's what's going on here. And you do wonder, like, it seems to me like, I guess two thoughts. Number one, it just seems like everything else, it seems so short-sighted by even the pro-Israel factions. And then, just because I have, been getting a lot of this heat thrown my way lately, it kind of seems like almost like I've gotten to the point in debating about Israel that nobody anymore is even saying like, oh, you got to go debate this guy or something like that. Like I was getting a lot of Douglas Murray was the one who everyone always used to throw at me. They used to go, oh, you should debate Douglas Murray. He'll destroy you on this. And now they're like, okay. People said Josh Hammer was going to destroy me. Dennis Prager was going to. But now no one's even trying to debate that anymore. They're just basically saying that I am responsible for all of the Jew hatred online or something like that. But I just go, for all these people who like Jew hatred on Twitter is their biggest concern. They're like, well, what do you think? What do you think getting into another catastrophic war in the Middle East on behalf of Israel is going to make this country look like? What do you think the response to that is going to be? It almost, to me, seems like a call to their bluff. Like you must not actually be that concerned about this because otherwise this is the last thing you would want to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, people they don't seem to really want to engage with that point. And this, when it comes to Yemen, because again, it's more in your face. Like it's just this isn't even part of the discussion. I mean, when do people say, "Oh, debate me on whether or not we should be bombing Yemen" or something like
Yeah.
that? And of course, the talking point when it comes to Yemen is that the Houthis are backed by Iran. If you read any mainstream
Yes.
coverage of it, they call them the Iran-backed Houthi rebels. They're the rebels, even though they've controlled Sana'a now for over 10 years. And an important point, because you could look at a map and you'll see the Houthi-controlled areas in the west, and the rest is not controlled by them. But that's where 80% of Yemenis live. That's where most of the population lives. So it's an important point. And Yemen used to be North and South Yemen. It's basically North Yemen that they control, the former country. But anyway, so the narrative is that they're Iran-backed, and they certainly receive support from Iran. What level, we don't really know. Essentially, how I understand it is that Iran probably helped them develop their missile and drone program, giving them these like missile components and drone components. And but they make them domestically. So it's not like they rely on Iran for weapon shipments. And this is something Trump has said, oh, Iran has to cut them off or we're going to, blame them for every attack. And he actually said something recently, like a couple of weeks ago, just in a press conference, he said, did you know, who knew the Houthis make their own missiles and drones? Could you believe that? It's like, yeah, I knew that. A lot of people knew that before you started bombing them. But anyway, back to your point. So it is the narrative that it's like, this is the axis, the anti-Israel axis. And I do think, Hezbollah is basically neutered at this point. Assad is out of Syria. They do really see the Houthis as a major thorn in Israel's side, because they just keep getting better and better at being able to send missiles and drones, in these long-range attacks. So, that's a big part of this, is trying to take out another one of Israel's enemies in the region. And of course, the big one is Iran. And I also think part of this bombing campaign is kind of as a threat to Iran. Because Trump's saying he's going to bomb Iran if they don't reach a deal. It's not an idle threat when you see him using 2 aircraft carriers and B-2 bombers stationed in Diego Garcia to bomb Yemen, to, really bomb the crap out of the country. I mean, over 1,000 airstrikes. It's really insane. And yeah, I think the fact that the U.S. is doing this for Israel could increase anti-Semitism more than you saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't help kill babies in Gaza.
Even more than mentioning the name Paul Wolfowitz, you think? You think this could?
That was too much.
Well, yeah, I know. It really was. It was the moment. It was the moment.
And one thing about this anti-Semitism stuff, like I think, obviously if you go on X, you see this stuff, you see these kind of anonymous accounts that Jordan Peterson was talking about on Joe Rogan, I guess. But I think not talking about this stuff and pretending like Israel doesn't have this influence over our foreign policy, yeah, like we'll add to that, fuel that fire more. But having people that can honestly discuss these things and aren't anti-Semites, but can discuss, realistically what's happening will lead less people down that path. So that whole talking point is just nonsense.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's something, there's like I mentioned this a lot on the show because it's I don't know, I think it's important, and it's important particularly to me. But like, so what pulled me into the libertarian world and set me on this trajectory to be whatever I am now was the Ron Paul Giuliani moment, and that Ron Paul was just making this, what I found to be at the time, and then since obsessively reading about this for many years, I've just been more and more convinced is the truth, is that like, there is a consequence to certain military actions, and that leads to creating a lot of hatred in the world. And that, there's all these different kind of like, different people have noted this. Of course, obviously, General McChrystal's insurgent math, 10 minus 2 equals 20. You keep killing people, and there's a lot of innocent people who get killed in the process, and then more and more people join up to the resistance. But it is, even as you're saying that, and of course, as Scott Horton points out and demonstrates in his book, Enough Already, on September 11th, bin Laden and all of his men were like a few hundred people. And then at the height of the global war on terror, it's like tens of thousands of bin Ladenite Islamists who are fighting. Like it's right in front of you that you're not eliminating them, you're creating more of them. But as you say this, it's maybe even like the first time I'm thinking about it exactly in this way. But imagine you could zoom out, like go back 20 years and you were to say, or maybe 25 years to keep all of them in, but like in terms of like Israel's enemies in the region, because again, this really was, anyone can go read the clean break memo. Like this was the strategy. Their strategy was like, listen, we're going to have a break from the peace process. We're going to have a break from this idea that we have to settle the Israel-Palestine issue in order for Israel to make peace with the broader Arab and Muslim world. And instead of settling that issue, we can just take out Israel's enemies in the broader Muslim and Arab world. And imagine you were to say to Israel, hey, you know your big enemies? All right, Saddam Hussein, gone. Muammar Gaddafi, gone. Bashar al-Assad, gone. Hezbollah's leadership, totally annihilated. Like all of that. And they go, shoot, now we got to go see about these Houthis. And you're like, oh, it's just kind of proof. It's like, yeah, you can never whack-a-mole enough to get them all gone. You just can't keep doing this to the Palestinians and think that there's not going to be resistance against that. And it's like in the same sense that like, even just within the Israel-Palestine conflict, like Israel's been dominating and occupying them for 60 years, and they're still dealing with resistance. You can never put it out enough because people do not much like to be brutally oppressed, and there's going to be resistance to that. It just seems so obvious to me.
Yeah, and when you talk about insurgent math and all that stuff, I mean, this applies, I think, so much with Yemen, with kind of who the Houthis are, like what their identity is. For the background on them, you know, something Douglas Murray said in your debate was, he was like, oh, Iran colonized, you know, these countries. He said that they colonized Yemen. And it's just such an absurd, it's funny for like a British guy to say that in the first place, but for
Yeah,
like
right.
to say that Iran colonized Yemen, I mean, again, it's just, it shows he has just no understanding of the situation in Yemen, who the Houthis are. They're a specific sect of Shiite Islam. They're Zaidi Shiites. And the area of North Yemen, like their kind of stronghold, Sadr, and most of the area that they control now, was ruled by Zaidi Shia imams for 1,000 years until the 1960s. And the Houthis, they started, I believe they were called the Believing Youth. They started as like a religious movement, kind of as a pushback to the Sunni, Wahhabism that the Saudis were pushing in Yemen. So they started as a religious movement, but they have very, deep roots in the country. And yeah, they're allied with Iran politically because they ended up being on the same side of certain things. But this idea that Iran, because people, again, if you read the media every day and you see Iran's proxy, the Iranian proxy, you would think that Iran like plucked some Shiites out of its own country and dropped them in Yemen, but it's just not true. And again, their whole identity is, part of this resistance against Israel, against U.S. imperialism, against the Gulf monarchs. And you do what the U.S. is doing now, bomb residential buildings full of civilians to kill one guy. And then, you think that's not going to, you talk about the insurgent math. I mean, this is just really building up their support. And my hope is that the reality is, because we see this talk about the U.S. backing a ground campaign, but what I'm also hearing is that the other factions in Yemen, some of them have rallied behind the Houthis now in response to them being the ones, really the only ones sticking up for the Palestinians at this point. So it's like, it really just kind of building up their whole, just their whole thing, their whole identity, their whole narrative. And if you're a Yemeni, just a regular guy in Yemen living in these conditions, I mean, you just got to put yourself in their shoes. We see what's happening in Gaza every day. Oh, well, that's why we're being bombed now by the Americans, because we're standing up for all those, those dead children you see on the news every single day. We're the only ones, standing up for that. And that's why the Americans, the evil empire is bombing us. I mean, it's just fertile ground for more recruitment for the Houthis, like to kind of a ridiculous degree.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it is I know, certainly I do know that, right, like Iran was arming Hezbollah for a while. I think this is a major part of the reason why they wanted Bashar al-Assad gone. But it is interesting. First of all, like at any time Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Houthis, any of the H's get written about, it's always Iran backed. And yet this logic never seems to apply. Like it's not like if Jordan ever does anything, they must be referred to as the U.S.-backed Jordanians do this, or the U.S.-backed Egyptians, or the U.S.-backed Saudis, or the U.S.-backed Israelis, or you know what I'm saying? Like it's just they never like apply this standard across the board. By the way, I mean, again, you know, a point I love to make, but you could also call Hamas the Israeli-backed Hamas militants launched October 7th. You know, like if you were to say it like that, it would, first of all, it would actually be much more accurate and much more damning and eye-opening to the whole situation. But it is an interesting tactic that they use that you're never, you know, it's funny because if I let's say I were to argue with someone like maybe on Joe Rogan with someone with a posh British accent, I were to say that like, hey, you know, the National Endowment for Democracy and the USAID poured $100 million into the Maidan Revolution. Well, that now I'm denying agency. You know, like you're denying agency if you bring that up, and yet referring to every militant group in the region as an Iranian proxy is somehow not denying agency. And so like you're like not even saying that Iran hasn't been political allies with some of these people, but they are their own groups with their own motivations as well.
Yeah, and as I understand, you know, Iran has a lot of sway over Hezbollah. You know, they're very closely aligned with them, over the Shiite factions in Iraq that the U.S. helped put in power. But when it comes to Yemen, I mean, the Houthis are like known as being much more their own thing. So yeah, it's just, and I've seen people say the opposite, but it's just not true. Like, so, but whenever we see, you know, what little mainstream coverage there is of the situation, it's like, oh, U.S. airstrike in Yemen killed 65 migrants. The Iran-backed Houthis say, like, they just kind of acting like everything's not really a big deal. What's happened? It's like, oh, it's just the Iran-backed Houthis that were bombing. You know, don't worry about all these civilians. So yeah, it's just and you talk about the consequences of blowback and everything for what's happening now. It just it's just there's such a better way to approach the whole region at this point. And I don't even think like Trump wouldn't be like, I think if Trump really wanted to bring peace, he has the ability. I mean, again, it's all Gaza's the key, but it just doesn't seem like he wants to do that.
All right, guys, let's take a moment and thank our sponsor for today's show, which is My Patriot Supply. Let me ask you something. If the grocery store shelves went empty tomorrow, would your family be ready? Personally, I trust My Patriot Supply with my family's food security, and here's why. They've helped millions of Americans prepare for the worst, and they have over 70,000 five-star reviews. Personally, I keep their 3-month emergency food kits on hand, and right now, you can get the same ones I use for $200 off. That's a huge discount, and believe me, My Patriot Supply almost never offers deals like this. The food kits give you 2,000 calories a day per person for 3 months. The food tastes great, lasts up to 25 years. It ships free with delivery in as little as 2 days. So take advantage of this deal and go to preparewithsmith.com. This $200 off discount is only for a limited time, so don't wait. Go to preparewithsmith.com right now. That's preparewithsmith.com. Get peace of mind while it's still available. All right, let's get back into the show. What do you make of Donald Trump, who appears to have at least temporarily thwarted the Israeli plans to launch attacks on Israel? On Iran. And now over the last couple of weeks, Netanyahu's been saying they're about to do it anyway. But it does seem like the plans that they had laid out involved the U.S. helping them, because of course they can't actually do any of this stuff without our help. Do you think, I mean, like this seems to me like a small temporary win, at least given a bad situation, but do you think he's like you said, I mean, he could be pushing for peace in this region, and he doesn't seem to be using any of the leverage he has, which is substantial. What do you make of that? Where do you see this all going?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that he's even just saying like, oh, if we don't reach a deal, we're going to bomb them is not, That's not good. You don't need to approach these negotiations like that. And I mean, when he was asked about this report recently, and somebody said it was in his Time interview, they said, "Oh, do you think Netanyahu's going to drag you into war?" And he said, "I'd go willingly." Basically, he said, "I could go into it willingly." And that if we do attack Iran, we'll be leading the pack. So he's, really making these threats. And a lot of people kind of point to his first term and like the threats against North Korea. But again, we're talking about a situation where in the same region, the U.S. has all this firepower that's bombing another country. And a big part of the buildup, sending the bombers, sending the aircraft carriers, and also sending air defenses to Israel to prepare for this potential war with Iran. Like, the U.S. has the military posture to do it. So, I mean, the fact that he chose not to bomb Iran, I mean, it's hard for me to give him credit for that, because like, it shouldn't even be a possibility in the first place. But it's just concerning. It does seem like he wants a deal. He does keep saying that, and while he makes these threats, and it looks like the negotiations are advancing. I mean, they've had 3 rounds, and both sides say they're going well. On the other hand, you have the Trump administration officials like Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz saying publicly that any deal must dismantle Iran's nuclear enrichment program altogether, which that's just a non-starter for Iran. But it looks like that's not the demand that they're making behind the scenes. So, I mean, it's tough to say where this is going to go. There was recently, over the weekend, a huge port explosion in Iran that I believe killed 60 people. And with things like that, I mean, the Iranians haven't made the accusation that it was an attack or sabotage, but Israel has a history of sabotage attacks inside Iran and of doing them to sabotage diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran. They did it. They detonated an explosive in an Iranian nuclear facility in April 2021 when Biden started negotiations with Iran. But again, so far, no Israeli sources have taken credit for that, or in the Iranians. There's like an Iranian member of parliament who accused the Israelis of being behind it, but the fact is we don't really know at this point. But something like that, like a sabotage attack, we might see things like that Netanyahu might do to try to sabotage the diplomacy, because I think he sees this as the time. This Trump administration is his chance, possibly his last chance, to get that war with Iran that he's always wanted. And then, imagine if the U.S. and Iran are engaged in a war. He could just do whatever he wants to the Palestinians in Gaza. There's not going to be nearly as much attention on it. They could advance their designs in the West Bank more freely. So yeah, it's he has a lot of motive to make this war happen, Netanyahu.
Do you think the way I've always felt about this, as I've been paying attention to it over the last, couple decades, is that it seems to me that the Iranians, much like I think this is kind of the way it always works with governments in general, but like governments they kind of have to at least pose as your protectors in order to preserve any perceived legitimacy amongst their people. And so the Iranians, like, for example, when they responded to the Israeli attacks back last year, and they sent those rockets, or they sent those missiles at Israel, but they gave the U.S. warning, and they didn't really send everything they had. They essentially, it seems like, similarly to after Donald Trump killed Soleimani, and they kind of sent like some rockets at U.S. bases but didn't kill anybody. Like, they want to, they basically want to act as if they've responded to kind of save face with their own people. But then at the same time, they don't really want this fight, because they know, I mean, if you could picture where Iran is, like if you could picture a map of them, like their neighbors are Iraq and Afghanistan. They've seen what the U.S. military has done to their 2 neighbors while threatening to do it to them for these entire 20 years. And it does almost seem like they don't actually want this fight. They want to, posture as if they're not pushovers and that they will respond. I think what a lot of the, it's like I almost think about, like an analogy, it would be that, like, it's, imagine you're like walking with your wife and your 2 kids down the street or something like that. I think we both got the same amount of kids. You were walking with your 2 kids and your wife, and you're surrounded by much tougher guys, and they're like talking shit and they're disrespecting you, and you're almost like, all right, okay, just take it. Let's keep walking. Like, I don't want anything to happen to my family here. But like at a certain point, if they cross a line, you're gonna be like, well, I guess I got to fight these guys and land as many punches as I can. I'm probably gonna lose, but I have to do something here. And it does seem like the Trump administration and the war hawks are presenting this as if it is an option to just take out the Iranian nuclear sites, like to just have a massive bombing campaign in Iran, and then that's it. We don't have to do like a full invasion like we did in Iraq. We could just do that and then go back to life as normal. My guess would be there is no way that Iran could allow that to happen without some type of response, and they have a lot of responses available to them. But what do you think about that? Like, is it possible for the Israelis and the American military to just take out the Iranian nuclear program and that's that?
I do not think so, but that is the talking point we hear. Like, I remember Tom Cotton said that recently in a hearing, and you see people who support this idea of bombing Iran, acting like it'll be no big deal. But I think it's very clear, if they take that step, because, what it would take to try to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities would be dropping the U.S.'s heaviest bunker busting bombs. They're like 30,000 pounds, because they built these facilities deep underground because in anticipation of something like this happening. So if the U.S. goes out and drops those bombs on that, they're going to respond. And the fact is that they have advanced ballistic missiles that can hit, I believe, about 10 U.S. bases in the region, probably more. And as you know, this is something Tucker's been talking about a lot lately. The Pentagon assessments are like hundreds or thousands of American casualties. And then what happens? Is Trump just going to be like, oh, well, that's that? No, then it's going to become an even bigger war. I don't really see a situation where the U.S. like tries to invade Iran. It's just not realistic. Like, nobody has the will. None of the people in the U.S. have the will. The U.S. military doesn't have the will. Where are they going to invade from? But I could see just like really heavy bombing, maybe some ground fighting in like Iraq or something, until somebody says, all right, enough. I guess we just got to negotiate here or something. But like, yeah, it's just, there's no way that the U.S. just takes out the nuclear facilities and that's it. The other thing is that Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. That's what U.S. intelligence has said. That's been the consensus since the early 2000s. But they use their nuclear program essentially as leverage, and they kind of use the threat of it turning into weaponization as leverage. And the conversation has changed inside Iran. You're seeing more calls for the Ayatollah to reverse his ban on making nukes. And an advisor to the Ayatollah said that if the U.S. and Israel attack, then we could change our position on nuclear weapons. They want there to be consequences for bombing them. And that New York Times report was interesting. It said that the plans to attack Iran could set back their nuclear program by a year. So suggesting that, they actually can't completely destroy it, which makes sense. So it would be like bombing a country under a phony pretext of them having a nuclear weapons program, and it could actually create one. So the whole thing, like, for every reason, it's just would be a very foolish thing to do. And there's just no reason to be this hostile against Iran right now, except for Israel.
Yeah, no, that's right. And, it reminds me even, right, like Douglas Murray said to me when I pointed out that the war in Afghanistan was not just about taking out al-Qaeda, but that we launched a 20-year regime change war against the Taliban. And he goes, well, you got dragged into the quicksand of war. And it's like, right. Yeah, that's right. That sure can happen. Not like if you look at the original, authorization of use of military force against Iraq, it was very narrow to take out Saddam Hussein. We took out Saddam Hussein very quickly, but then we were there for another 2 decades, and I guess still have some military forces there today. Even at the beginning of the Ukraine war, Joe Biden was very clear that the Ukraine can win with sanctions, that we could support them just with sanctions. That was supposed to be the extent of American involvement. And you just see this all over the place. So the idea that, right, like we're going to just bomb the crap out of Iran, but that'll be it. man, you want to talk about risky games? That is a risky one. And as you said, it just seems like it would, it would be a situation where they would have to really respond. And if they really responded, then how the hell are we not going to really respond to that? I mean, again, just try to even imagine, there was, after Trump killed Soleimani, there was some restraint showed on both sides of that. And look, you could say killing Soleimani was probably one of the worst things Donald Trump ever did, just in terms of how risky a move it was. But then you could also say that one of the best things he ever did was just leave it at that and not, respond any further. But if you could just like run a counterfactual in your head and imagine that like the Iranian retaliatory strike had killed 10 US servicemen. Is it possible that Donald Trump would have? I certainly don't think so. I don't think there's any world in which Mr. Tough Guy Donald Trump, with all of his Miriam Adelson money and all of the neocon hawks that he has around him, it would possibly be able to say, you're going to just let them kill 10 US soldiers and not have a bigger response to that. And so this is, the quicksand of war, as even neocon Douglas Murray would call it. You just see it right in front of you. And again, for what benefit are we even playing with this game? So that the country of Iran, that poses no threat to any of us, might continue to pose no threat to any of us. It's just it's madness.
Yeah, and fortunately, it seems like the lesson Trump got out of the Soleimani thing was that he could hit Iran hard and not really suffer any consequences. That seems to be. And you see this kind of talking point from him and like his supporters, like, oh, Iran didn't do anything after that, after we killed Soleimani. Well, they killed Soleimani under the pretext that he was helping plot attacks on U.S. bases in the region. A U.S. soldier was killed a few weeks earlier in Kirkuk, Iraq, and we don't really know who launched that rocket. And then in March of that year, more American, I believe one or two, or maybe some British soldiers, I forget exactly the number, but at least one American was killed. Like just a couple months later. So the whole talking point is, oh, Iran didn't, nothing happened after we killed Soleimani. It kind of solved all the problems, but it's just not the case. So, but that is, you hear Trump whenever, how he always says, oh, this would have never happened if it was me. Iran was broke. He touts his first, administration's Iran policy, even though it was a complete failure, as like this great thing that like brought peace, which is just not the case. So unfortunately, it seems like that's his thinking.
All right, guys, let's take a moment and thank our sponsor for today's show, which is Sheath Underwear. Of course, you know and love them by now. Sheath uses moisture wicking technology to create underwear that keeps everything breathable and incredibly comfortable for you downstairs. Sheath Smart Underwear comes in a number of different styles, including a brief with a dual pouch, which is highly recommended. I was a little skeptical about the dual pouch at first, but can't live without it now. I've been wearing Sheath underwear exclusively. They're the only underwear that I wear, the only underwear that I have been wearing for years. So go support a longtime sponsor of this show and get yourself the most comfortable pair of boxer briefs you will ever own while you do it. Check them out, sheathunderwear.com. Promo code PROBLEM for 20% off your order. They ship anywhere in the world. Sheathunderwear.com. Promo code PROBLEM for 20% off. All right, let's get back into the show. So do you, if you had to, you cover this stuff, for a living and in much more detail than I do. What, if you had to guess, where do you think happens from here?
Man, it's tough. I think one big risk here, when we talk about American casualties is the Houthis. They're full of surprises. I wouldn't be surprised if we see one of their drones or missiles hit a U.S. warship. Or maybe they'll try to target a base across the Red Sea in Djibouti or something. Or who knows? I mean, you just never know what they might be able to hit. There's a risk there. And then of the U.S. really escalating in Yemen and trying to back a ground invasion. But what, obviously the big thing is Iran. And a few weeks ago, I was much more pessimistic. I thought it was like inevitable. When he started bombing Yemen and was making all these threats.
Yeah.
And Israel's just unleashing in Gaza again. It's just like, oh, wow, we're actually just going to go into war with Iran, aren't we? But since the negotiations started and the fact that they seem to be, there's progress happening. They've even had some direct engagement. And it looks like obviously Iran doesn't want a war with the US. And I think they're making that very clear to Trump. So that I think the risk is a little lower, but it's so hard for me to imagine them signing a deal with Iran. It's like that was like the Iran that was like the JCPOA that Obama negotiated, because like every Republican is going to be against it. Even it's just hard for me to imagine like an Iran nuclear deal happening right now. And that is the thing. It seems like is the only thing that'll prevent war. So I think the chances are still pretty high of this turning into the U.S. and Iran launching some strikes. Sorry, the U.S. and Israel launching strikes on Iran. I think there's a good chance of that still happening here. And then who knows where things escalate from there. But it's just, I just don't see, I follow the stuff in Gaza every day, the negotiations. It's like, you saw Trump the other day saying, claiming that he told Netanyahu he's got to be good to the people in Gaza. And, we're taking care of the aid situation, but there's no aid, there's no food going in there, and they're just killing dozens of people every day. So it just doesn't seem like he's willing to put any pressure on Israel to stop that right now, even though the Israeli hostage with American citizenship has apparently, according to Hamas, has gone missing after an Israeli airstrike. I mean, you think that would be enough if that was his priority to get him to stop this, but it just goes on. It just goes on, and everybody's focused kind of more on the domestic stuff here in the U.S. I mean, for good reason. There's a lot of stuff happening, but it's just, one thing really kind of showed how the media views all this stuff. After the Signalgate thing, Trump was in the Oval Office talking to reporters, and they were like grilling him about them having this conversation in Signal and including the Atlantic reporter. And he was trying to deflect, and the way he was trying to do it, he's like, I don't get why nobody asked me about the airstrikes against the Houthis. They're going great. We're launching all these. We're bombing them. And like nobody's saying, well, actually, they're not going great. Like nobody challenged him on that. They just kept asking about the things. So it's like, and this is the issue. I mean, even with all this going on with Iran, it's like a lot of Americans don't really follow it. And that if this does lead to the U.S. and Israel bombing Iran hitting back with missiles, killing Americans, then that's it. We're at war with Iran, and however that will play out. So there's just a real risk of this unless something really changes.
Yeah, and man, it probably can't be overstated how as disastrous as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria and Somalia and Yemen, as bad as they were, Iran is biting off a lot more than any of those. I mean, by far. And they're much more formidable. And that's not to say that they're a more powerful military than the United States of America, but like neither was the Taliban. And they outlasted us in that war. So yeah, it's dangerous times. I tend to agree with your assessment. I would love everybody. Welcome to a brand new episode of Part of the Problem. I'm thrilled. Oh, real quick before we start the show, getting on a plane tomorrow, Tacoma. There are still some tickets available for at least a couple of the shows. So Tacoma and then Spokane with Robbie the Fire Bernstein, comicdavesmith.com if you want to go grab tickets and come on out. It's going to be a fun time. This was a real fun run of shows last year. Looking forward to doing it again. And I'm also more immediately looking forward to this show because we have back with us once again Dave DeCamp, who listeners of this show I'm sure know Dave DeCamp and have read him, but if you happen to not, you really got to familiarize yourself with Dave. His work over at antiwar.com is just invaluable to me personally. You really are a big part of how I stay informed on what's going on in the world. Every day I'm reading your articles over there. And of course, he also hosts the Anti-War radio podcast, which is a great way to just catch up on what's going on in the world. I know at all times the U.S. is involved in so many conflicts that it is hard to keep them all straight in your head. But really, everybody in our world just knows how important antiwar.com is. It's really like just the most important project on the internet. And it is it's something that you hear all types of people, even like, it's run by a bunch of good Ron Paul libertarians, but all types of left-wingers and right-wingers you will hear crediting anti-war with how they stay informed, antiwar.com that is, with how they stay informed. So thank you, Dave, for all the work you're doing over there. And before we get into the meat of the show, it is the fundraiser time for antiwar.com. So just as I was saying how important a project this is, it can't continue unless good people like you help them to. This isn't, when you're in the business of promoting wars, you're going to get all types of think tanks and defense contractors and all types of people in DC are going to be throwing money your way. But when you're in the business of exposing the war criminals, you got to rely on, regular people to contribute. So if you can, highest possible recommendation, if there's any organization you could contribute to, there's no better one than antiwar.com.
Well, thanks, Dave. I really appreciate that intro. That's very kind. And yeah, if people could help us out, antiwar.com, we're not like the biggest news site out there, but as you mentioned, a lot of kind of prominent people, including yourself, do read antiwar.com and rely on us and constantly cite us. And the only way that we're able to do this work is from donations from our readers. We're kind of a David fighting against the Goliath of, the military industrial complex and all the think tanks that get these huge grants from the weapons makers and foreign governments. But we're constantly fighting against all those narratives and trying to provide people with news and viewpoints. And again, as you mentioned, from all over the political spectrum. It is a libertarian run site, but it's a single issue kind of coalition project. So if people could help us out, we really appreciate it. antiwar.com/donate for that.
Yeah, I remember that. Like, that was one of the things that was always when I first found antiwar.com, which must have been like around 2009 or something like that. But I remember that's what used to blow my mind, is to just be like, hey, they got a Noam Chomsky article and a Pat Buchanan article right here next to each other, and they're both making a lot of sense. And like, it did a lot for me, not just to inform me about, conflicts going on around the world, but to kind of like shatter that false paradigm that I had in my head of like left versus right, that, not to say left and right don't exist, but that it's not exactly the way they would tell you it is. And, the hacks in the middle will call that horseshoe theory or whatever, but really it's just people who are against mass murder campaigns who are making sense. And you can come to that from a left wing or a right wing point of view, and very easily from a libertarian point of view, because of course war is the health of the state.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Chomsky and Buchanan, because that really goes to show, there's an interview Buchanan did back in 2017, and the reporter went to his house and said, he starts his morning off reading all these newspapers and then going on antiwar.com and to check the news, and a little brief description of us. And then Chomsky, a couple years ago, he did some seminar or something, and he mentioned us. So we emailed him and said, he's like not notorious. He's known for answering his email. So we emailed him and said, hey, could you write us a fundraiser letter? And he said, yeah. And he wrote us a really nice letter and made it very clear that he does read antiwar.com. So not only do we publish people from all over, people read us, prominent, influential people.
Yeah. And this stuff really is important, because it's like, at least for me, it's a real, it's like it's something in my utility belt, or what was that? Is that what Batman had? But when it's the thing that where people, look at, me going and doing some debate or something like that, and they'll be like, oh yeah, Dave, you got that guy or whatever. But it's because I've got the information in my head, and I've been armed by antiwar.com, largely. I mean, obviously with Scott Horton there being, kind of chief amongst the whole crew, but you're right there next to him. And it's a big part of how, it's like, if you're going into battle, it's like I'm coming over and Dave DeCamp is just handing me a new weapon to go into battle with. So it certainly for me has been invaluable, and I know for a lot of other people. And the topic we'll try, to cover a couple things today, but the major topic that we wanted to talk about today was this piece that you just wrote over at antiwar.com, which was it's titled "Trump Administration Shatters the Record for Annual U.S. Airstrikes in Somalia." And of course, if you read the piece, you will see that he shattered his own record, which he set back in 2019. And you had reached out to me about it, and as soon as you did, I was like, yeah, this is really something we should talk about on the show, because it's something that the war in Somalia really is like the forgotten war. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, but there is something like, even for my audience, I'm sure there's some people who like aren't even aware of what we're still bombing Somalia, like that, like maybe just assumed, like they knew that was one of the countries that I always list off that we're at war with, but you assume, isn't that over? Aren't the terror wars kind of over? I mean, people know we still have some troops in Iraq and we still have some troops in Syria, but like we're not really actively in terror wars anymore, are we? And then in fact you find out that we're shattering the record. And I do think that, I'm talking about my audience here. If you were to just ask regular Americans, I'd be interested to see what the results of that polling would be. But like, just stop regular Americans. What percentage of them even know that there's even tensions with Somalia? Like, I think if you stopped a random American on the street, the best you could hope for would be like they saw Black Hawk Down and know that during the 90s there was something that went on there and some of our helicopters went down. I don't know how many of them even know that we've been at war there. But really, depending on how you measure all these things, you call it the longest war in American history. And it's a CIA JSOC war. And so it doesn't, it didn't get the attention that Iraq and Afghanistan did. And it wasn't quite as like, I don't know, it didn't have some of the sexy features of the other wars that made it stick in people's heads. But man, how bad for the collective soul of a nation. Not that I actually believe that exists, but there's something really disturbing about the fact that you could be the citizen of a country that's at war and you don't even know about it. I just find something so profoundly disturbing about that, whether you would ever support a war or be against the war. The idea that you're fighting one that most of your people don't even know about is just dark. All right, guys, let's take a moment and thank our sponsor for today's show, which is The Wellness Company. We've all heard the studies. Testosterone in young men is drastically decreasing every decade. One major study in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism found a healthy 22-year-old in 2000 had double the testosterone of a 22-year-old in 2025. So if you're in your 30s or 40s or 50s, you might want to check this out. Mars from The Wellness Company, a doctor-formulated nutraceutical designed to restore vitality without synthetic hormones or stimulants.
Yeah, and this isn't just, a drone strike here and there. I mean, this is heavy airstrikes that the U.S. is launching in Somalia now. So, I mean, one of the reasons why nobody knows is because there's literally zero coverage of this air war in U.S. media. I'm literally the only, as far as I'm aware, person in American media, writing articles who's covering this regularly. Once in a while, you'll see a story from like one of the military focus sites, like Stars and Stripes had one recently that's like, oh, we're sure launching a lot of airstrikes in Somalia. But I've been covering, the day-to-day basically, and the information is extremely limited. So I've basically been working with what AFRICOM, U.S. Africa Command, tells me, and they do not share many details. So we really don't know what's happening on the ground. But just to get into the numbers first. So when I wrote that article last week, it was after the U.S. was involved in a 2-week campaign against an ISIS affiliate in Puntland, northeastern Somalia. And during that 2-week battle, the U.S. launched 9 airstrikes. So again, this is not just a drone strike here and there. So, they didn't specify the number. So I asked AFRICOM, how many strikes did you launch in that time? And they told me 9. And that brought up the total annual number of U.S. airstrikes in 2025 to 68, breaking the record that Trump set in 2019 at 63. And now Biden did continue this drone war, but it was like a dozen, maybe a year. He did send troops back there. I'll get into some of the more of the background in a minute, but just to kind of get into the numbers. And over the weekend, there was more U.S. airstrikes against al-Shabaab in southern Somalia. So the number stands right now at 71 in September. I think there's a good chance, if the rate continues, that we're going to get close to 100 U.S. airstrikes in Somalia, as you said, in a war that I would guess more than 90% of Americans aren't aware of. Yeah. I would be curious to see what a poll would find. But again, the reason why is because there's no coverage about it. And even, as you said, like among our people, a lot of people are not aware that this goes on, and they might think, oh, yeah, like they launch a drone strike once in a while, kind of like in Syria. Once in a while, the U.S. bombs an ISIS guy, even though they're supporting the Al Qaeda guy that just took over the country. But this is a significant battles that the U.S. is involved in, and this is something we saw from the first Trump administration. When he first came in, he loosened the rules of engagement to allow more airstrikes, and airstrikes kind of ramped up in all of the different conflict zones in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and Somalia, and Yemen as well. And a lot of those winded down towards the end of his administration. But Somalia, they really kept at it. And then Biden came in at the end of the first Trump administration. He pulled a few hundred U.S. troops out of Somalia that Trump sent there in the first place when he first came in. Biden comes in, he sends the troops back, continues the drone war, but at a lower level, and he reimposes some restrictions on drone strikes and counterterrorism operations. So Trump comes in again this year and loosens those rules again, and expands the authorization for airstrikes. Essentially, what it allows is lower level U.S. military commanders to call in airstrikes without getting approval from the White House outside of areas they don't consider combat zones. And right now, the only two areas that are technically combat zones for the U.S., the only two countries, is Iraq and Syria. So by loosening those rules, they've just really ramped up the bombing and to this level. And for the real, the historical background on this, I would recommend everybody go to antiwar.com or open up your copy of Enough Already, the book by Scott Horton. But if you go to antiwar.com, we published, I believe it was the whole chapter on Somalia, and just search search at antiwar.com, Scott Horton, Somalia, and it's the first thing that comes up to read the background. You mentioned Black Hawk Down. I mean, the Battle of Mogadishu, as they called it, which many people are aware of, but this current war really started after 9/11 and the start of the terror wars. The CIA was backing these warlords in Somalia, the same people they fought against in Black Hawk Down.
Yeah, that's an important detail. Like, it was the same group, and I think some of the kids of the guys who shot down our choppers were the ones who we started backing. And George W. Bush, who everyone knows for his wisdom in foreign policy, but can we just real quick just interject before you get in there, because in that middle time period there, like what a lot of people, I think some people still remember that, I got in this argument, by the way, just literally just came into my mind, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a pretty big like Twitter account, like a conservative guy. You could go, if you go search my Twitter history, you could probably find this, where I was like arguing with this guy, and he hit me. It started with him hitting me with the old line that people used to say to libertarians: "Oh, you're such a libertarian, go live in Somalia." And then I was like, oh, actually Somalia was doing a lot better until George W. Bush launched a war there. And then he responded and he went, no one launched a war in Somalia. Like, this guy was like a professional political commentator having a public feud with someone, and was so confident that he would have heard about this if it existed, that he just publicly went, there's no such thing there. But anyway, Somalia was a communist country. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they basically devolved into like warring tribes. And none of them really could take over. None of them had enough juice. So they did live without a state for several years there, where it was, not, I would call it a libertarian society, but it was an anarchist society. And this became the punchline to oh, you're an ANCAP, go live in Somalia. But actually, when you look back at it, Somalia was doing the best it had ever done in this time period. And it was the standard of living was raising at a faster rate than any country in sub-Saharan Africa. That doesn't mean it's perfect, but it was much better until 9/11. And then at the end of 2001, George W. Bush sent JSOC in there. And this is what destroyed the whole country. So just to make this very petty point, but to all of the people who ever in your face libertarian, go live in Somalia, it's like, yeah, actually George W. Bush ruined that too. It would have been better. So anyway, I'm sorry. Take off.
Yeah, and you could also you could look at Somaliland in the north, kind of the northwest, that has basically been an autonomous country since the 1990s, and there hasn't been war there, and they've done relatively well compared to the rest of Somalia. But yeah, so as Scott lays out in the article, the U.S. starts backing these warlords again. Not again. They start backing the same warlords that they fought against. And in 2006, a group called the Islamic Courts Union took power in Mogadishu from these CIA-backed warlords, and they were in power very briefly. Ethiopia invaded. The U.S. backed this Ethiopian invasion. There's reports that U.S. gunships were giving them air support, and they ousted the Islamic Courts Union. And then Al-Shabaab is the radical offshoot of the Islamic Courts Union, and their first claimed attack was in 2007, and it was against Ethiopian troops occupying Mogadishu. And then essentially the African Union and the U.S. and the Europeans, backed this new transitional government, which they made official in 2012. And they've been fighting Al-Shabaab ever since. So it's been a failure. It's been a complete disaster trying to prop up this very weak central government, which I don't even like calling it a central government, because if you actually look at the map of Somalia, they control very little territory in what they consider the internationally recognized borders. And especially in recent years, they've really suffered they've lost a lot of territory to Al-Shabaab. And also there's an offshoot of Al-Shabaab that turned into an ISIS affiliate that's up in Puntland, which also essentially acts as an autonomous region. They recently withdrew from the federal system and cut ties with the U.S.-backed government. And there's been some fighting between the government-backed clans and Puntland forces. I mean, so the whole, just U.S. intervention has been a disaster. And there was a report in the New York Times back in April that the Al-Shabaab's offensive was very successful, that they thought Mogadishu was next, that Mogadishu could fall to Al-Shabaab. And this was a meeting in the administration, and apparently State Department officials recommended actually evacuating the embassy in Mogadishu. But there was another side led by Sebastian Gorka, who's Trump's National Security Council counterterrorism official, that said, no, let's escalate. Let's double down on propping up this government. And he won the day. And they've really escalated and ramped up these airstrikes. And, people ask me, are there civilian casualties? I mean, the fact is we don't know. AFRICOM doesn't share any information besides announcing a strike and saying how many they've launched. And then the media, it's tough to know what's happening on the ground in Somalia. But all kind of the counterterrorism experts agree that there's no winning this war against Al-Shabaab. It's very similar to the war in Afghanistan against the Taliban. A weak foreign installed government fighting against a Sunni insurgency. It's just, we're just offsetting kind of the inevitable that eventually one day they're going to have to either negotiate with Al-Shabaab, or the government's just going to fall and they're going to walk into Mogadishu like the Taliban walked in to Kabul. So, it's probably going to go one way or another.
Yeah, there's something, and this Afghanistan is a good comparison, because there's something that is, as disturbing as fighting wars of choice and wars of aggression already, that's already pretty wrong. But there is something about fighting them even after you can't achieve your goals. Even after that, Donald Trump acknowledged in 2016 that Afghanistan was unwinnable. We still fought the war for another 5 years. And you're like, well, what are you doing at this point? I mean, it's one thing to maybe come up with some justification for fighting a war if you think you can achieve whatever the end is, maybe. But when you can't, to continue it seems just totally indefensible. And on top of that, I mean, when you're saying we don't know, exactly what the civilian, death toll is, but we do, in the broader scheme of the war, right? We know there was this massive famine that hit, what was that, in 2010 or 2011? And the famine, there was it was the entire region was affected, but only in Somalia did you see people dying, and they were dying of by the hundreds of thousands at that point, hundreds of thousands of people starving to death, and all because their food distribution and supply chains were all messed up because of the war. So these are essentially casualties of the war. And so what you've got here is a war where at least hundreds of thousands of people have died as a result of it. You can't win the thing. It's still continuing, and the average American has no idea it's going on. It seems pretty indefensible on every level.
Yeah. And, if you remember, in the first Trump administration, as you said, fighting an unwinnable war, he really ramped up the airstrikes in Afghanistan. I mean, to levels that we didn't see since the initial invasion. And what did that do? What did that achieve? Nothing. And so it's going to be the same thing with these airstrikes that we're seeing against al-Shabaab. And again, very heavy, week-long battles, and they recently retook one village. But I mean, al-Shabaab has been, they recently took a lot of territory. So they might claw some back, but it's not like a sustainable thing here that's happening. The African Union apparently, they have troops there that are fighting as well, but they seem like they don't want anything to do with this war anymore. And there was reports that the U.S. was going to cut funding to the African Union mission there. I don't know if that's actually happened, but they continue the airstrikes, and they continue funding the DeCamp, which is a special military unit of the Somali military that's funded and trained by the U.S. So it just goes on, and there's just no, what's the end goal? There's no debate here. Nobody's even talking about it because nobody's aware of it. And that's really what I'm trying to do, writing these articles, like a headline, like Trump shatters the record for U.S. airstrikes in Somalia. Doesn't that seem like a significant story? And it just doesn't really get much attention, because sometimes other media outlets pick up our stuff. But this Somalia thing, man, it's just it just goes on, and people just kind of shrug their shoulders. And I think one thing you mentioned earlier, it's not really sexy. It doesn't fit in with a lot of the narrative about what's happening in the Middle East. A lot of people say, oh, it's about Yemen and the Houthis because Somalia is on the Gulf of Aden, and that's really more northeastern Somalia. But the U.S. has a base in Djibouti. I mean, look at Djibouti on the map. You can't really get closer to the Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen than that. I just don't really think that that's what this is about. This is kind of just a holdover of these terror wars. The machine is just kind of feeding the beast that is the military-industrial complex, and nobody's complaining about it, so it just goes on. And when we talk about the civilian casualties, there's no oversight. So the Pentagon and AFRICOM, they don't have to answer any questions because there's just no attention or oversight on this war at all. So that makes me think there probably are some bad things happening on the ground with these airstrikes.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a reasonable assumption to think that when there's absolutely no oversight, there will be more, atrocities committed than there would otherwise be if there was some type of oversight. And it really is and I'm not trying to I'll put myself in this category too. It's crazy that I could maybe have listeners who don't even know that this thing is going on, or at least not really be aware of the scope of it. But it really is a crazy comment on kind of the entire broader anti-war movement, that there's just not more pressure put on this thing. And I will say, I hate playing this card because it does get totally overused all the time. But it is kind of interesting where even a lot of the lefties who have woken up over Israel, Gaza, and kind of rejoined us in this anti-war place where we've been the whole time. And they'll talk about the racial component of it a lot, that there's a whole lot of European looking people in Israel and a whole lot of brown people in Palestine. And there's this kind of racism that goes along with it. But then for whatever reason, when it's just objectively speaking, out of all the terror wars, the darkest skinned target that we're going at, it does seem like there's just doesn't seem to work up as much sympathy. And look, I'm not saying that's the entirety of it. There's other factors as well, but there is something to I don't know. I've spent, I don't know about you, Dave, but for the last 15 years, I've been lectured by the left about internalized bigotry and stuff like this. And it is kind of wild that
he's kind of an outlier.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, you think about all the criticism of Trump right now, and he's breaking records for dropping bombs on a country in Africa. Don't you think the left, the liberals, or whoever would be on that? That would be something they'd be at least looking at and saying, what's going on here? A lot of the narrative, it kind of works on people because I tweet about this a lot. I say, oh, we broke the records for bombs on Somalia. And I'll see people like, well, we're not bombing Somalia. We're launching airstrikes in support of the government. It's like, well, look at the map, see how much territory they control and how much support they have. And literally just 2 of the major regions pulled out of the federal government over like changes to the Constitution. So this is not viewed as a legitimate government by most people in Somalia. But that narrative seems to work. And then the other one is, oh, well, we're just killing ISIS guys in the one bombing. It actually is 2 wars now, because it's in Puntland, where the U.S. is backing local forces against ISIS, and then al-Shabaab in the south. And people say, oh, we're just killing terrorists. And it's like, okay, so you're just going to take their word for it. It's literally like making the argument of, why should we leave Afghanistan? Like, we're just killing terrorists. We're just killing the Taliban. Yeah. It's just a smaller scale. So it doesn't, for a number of reasons, I don't think it's attention. I think that's one of it. It is small compared to Afghanistan, but it's still raging.
Well, it's also like, we have to go off the information that we have. And I know like there were a couple like big studies that were done during the Obama's massive drone bombing campaign in Pakistan. I remember there was one that I think came up with like 96% of the people killed by the drone bombings weren't the intended target. And that's not even getting into like whether they had the right target or not, because that is quite often it's not a given that just because you're on the U.S. kill list that you are actually the bad guy. Of course, like one of the major ways that that DC determines who's supposed to be on that list is to pay locals to give them names of terrorists. And obviously, we could all see like the incentive problems with that is that then they're incentivized to give you as many names as they can. But if you're telling me that the one that we know about, 96% of the time you were getting civilians, my guess is you didn't turn around to be batting 1,000 in Somalia, and you're probably killing a lot of innocent people there too.
Yeah, and this is different because that, those kill lists, like, they claim that they're like targeted, that they're targeting specific people. And that has happened in Somalia, like in a few of the strikes. But for the most part, it's the government forces on the ground calling in airstrikes from the U.S. So, they have no idea. I think they probably have no idea what they're really bombing. And then when it comes to the ISIS, it's in a very rural part of the mountain, like a mountain range. They're bombing caves. Once in a while, they put out videos of the strike, and it's just, you can't tell what's going on down there. And it's like, we just really have no idea. And who are these forces in Puntland that we're backing, and there's just no conversation about it. We're just, we're going to help them with airstrikes and everything.
Yeah. You wonder if like, with as loose as the supposed justifications are for so many U.S. wars or U.S. backed wars, you do kind of feel like, if you asked Joe Biden why we needed to keep arming Ukraine, he would have had an answer for you, and it wouldn't have been good or compelling to us, but he'd have had something. Or if you ask Donald Trump why we need to, bomb Iran, he'll say we can't let them go nuclear, or say, and I just wonder, like, if Donald Trump was just asked about this, does he even have a thing prepared? Like, would he even have anything? If somebody, like, if you were in the White House press corps and you were able to say, Mr. President, you just broke the record for strikes in a year in Somalia, like, why are you doing this? I really don't think he'd even have a reason. Like, it's not even like there's been ever a stated reason of why we have to do this.
Yeah, no, we haven't heard anything from like the officials. When they launched the first airstrikes that this administration launched in Somalia was against the ISIS affiliate, and they were like huge airstrikes. And Trump like posted a video of it on Truth Social and said, we killed this amount of terrorists or whatever. But since then, I mean, we they don't even discuss it. And when I wrote the story that they broke the record, I mentioned it to somebody, and he said, "Oh, I bet Trump's happy that he broke the record." And my response was, "I bet he doesn't even know."
Yeah.
I bet there's a good chance he has no idea that he's launched more airstrikes in Somalia in a single year than any other president, including himself, in history.
Right.
So, Yeah, and it is really. It does say. I think it is like it does say something about our country and kind of the way living in the empire. And this might be a good segue. I mean, the U.S. military just blew a boat out of the water in the Caribbean, claiming that it was carrying drugs. And actually, they did something similar in Somalia a few months ago. They bombed a boat and claimed it was smuggling weapons. And I remember thinking, like, how could you know that? How could you know everybody on the boat is even aware that they're smuggling weapons? Like, how could you really know that? And they're probably just relying on like whoever their allies are, whatever they tell them about that boat. And now we see it. I mean, this is a precedent has been set now. If you want to get into this, by this U.S., I believe it was an airstrike. It hasn't been confirmed. Maybe a drone or something. The U.S. bombing a boat, claiming that it's carrying drugs and killing, according to President Trump, 11 people, which he calls terrorists. I mean, I think we really just kind of crossed a line here, and it is very concerning.
Yeah, there's something so disturbing about like, and even just seeing the reaction, at least from what I've seen of it, is like, yeah, that's all you got to do is say like they had drugs on the boat, and then everyone's like, yeah, great job. Great, killed some drug dealers or some terrorists and prevented drugs from coming in. And there's something where like, look, as horrific as the war in Iraq was under George W. Bush, there was almost in a weird way something calming, just to like your concern with your fellow countrymen, that like they had to lie to you and tell you that Saddam Hussein was in on 9/11 and had nuclear weapons, and he was going to hand them off to the terrorists who were going to use them to nuke Kansas, and then at least put your uncle in a position where he was like, well, we can't live with that, and so okay, there's at least like some, but this thing where there are people who literally didn't even know there was a thing, didn't even know there was a conflict or anything that we were supposed to be mad about. It's not as if like Venezuela, like what threat are you saying they pose to the United States of America, aside from the fact that a bunch of poor people from there want to come here after the country's been destroyed by socialism and U.S. interference, and that they'll just root for this. Just root for it, like even without like any real story having been told to them or any propaganda that would even like, as ridiculous as the idea that Saddam Hussein posed some imminent threat to the United States of America is, at least they did convince people that. Whereas in this case, it's just people cheering on something that they know poses no real threat to America, where real people died. And then again, it's just this, take the government's word for it. Well, he says they were terrorists dealing drugs. Okay, we're for it. It's depressing that this works on people.
Yeah, it is. And, another plug here for antiwar.com. I mean, that's kind of the purpose of following us, is that when these wars do start, like, we've been kind of following it, the buildup, and we can call out the lies in real time very easily. Same thing happened with the bombing campaign against the Houthis. That was the last time I was on your show. We talked about that. It was very clear it was going to fail. They were lying to us about why they were doing it. And they slaughtered a whole bunch of civilians in that one, more than 250. And then they ended it and said, oh, it was a success. It's like, what? They basically gave up on trying to get the Houthis to stop targeting Israel. That's what really happened. But the whole narrative, but anyway, that's kind of another story. Yeah. But when it comes to this Venezuela thing, you're right. I've seen this, and like people say, oh, this is what I voted for. And I've also seen people, MAGA people, like quote tweet someone criticizing it and be like, oh, I can't believe this many people are defending narco terrorists. And it's like, that's a term that you just heard for the first time, probably. Yeah. But so there's a lot, like, we're really being, they're lying to us, which isn't a surprise. And in a lot of different ways, like there's just so much coming at us with this whole Venezuela thing. I'm struggling to figure out where to like start here, but I would go back to the first Trump administration. They declared the election in Venezuela illegitimate, and they stopped recognizing Maduro as the president, and they declared that Juan Guaido was the interim president, and they essentially tried to install him in a failed coup. That this was John Bolton's policy. Marco Rubio, as a senator, was really in support of this. And Rubio and other like Cuban Americans, especially, in Miami, Florida, they really agitate for this to continue the blockade on Cuba, which is really a relic of the Cold War that hasn't achieved anything. But that goes on because they have a lot of political influence, and they're also very anti-Venezuela and anti, the government, and anti the government in Nicaragua. I think John Bolton called those three countries the troika of tyranny when he was in the first Trump administration. So they imposed really heavy sanctions, which essentially amounted to an economic blockade and made the migrant situation much worse. A lot more people fled Venezuela. After that, I think it was in 2019 or maybe 2020, Bill Barr, then Attorney General, this is when the narco-terrorist thing first really started, indicted Maduro and top Venezuelan government officials claiming that they're narco-terrorists. And the allegation is over cocaine. But if you actually look at the numbers, the vast majority of cocaine that comes into the U.S. first is produced in Colombia and also goes through the Western Pacific. It doesn't go through the Caribbean. A small amount does, but it's nothing compared to the other parts. So it's clearly, this whole indictment is about regime change. It's not about stopping the flow of drugs. Yeah, I mean, so just the fact that the reality of the drugs, where the drugs actually flow, because this is specifically about cocaine. That's what these allegations go back to. When you actually look at the data there, it's clear that this isn't about stopping the flow of drugs to the U.S. This is about regime change. And the fact that you have Marco Rubio involved in this in 2019, when they tried to do the regime change against Maduro, Rubio tweeted a picture of Gaddafi, the before and after, a picture of him right as he was being brutally murdered. So that's the guy who's really running the show here. So I think it's important to understand that, I think there is a legitimate, I understand the sentiment among people. I come from a place that was ravaged by opiates and then heroin and fentanyl. I know a lot of people who died because of that. And I get the sentiment that we should go after these people flooding our country with those drugs. But, the demand is still going to be there, and the drugs are going to find their way in. But the fact is that Trump and really, it's a lot of this. So much of this is Rubio. They're taking advantage of that legitimate sentiment from the MAGA base and using it for this regime change effort, which is clearly what this is, because they also increased the bounty on Maduro to $50 million. They deployed all these warships. I mean, there's an armada of U.S. Navy warships in the Southern Caribbean. And instead of stopping a boat to check if it had drugs on it, they blew it out of the water and killed 11 people. I mean, it's just the whole thing is really nuts. And they claim that Maduro is the leader of a cartel, the Cartel de los Soles, or the Cartel of the Suns, which doesn't actually exist. So that is a label that has been used for an alleged network of Venezuelan government and military officials who they say are involved in drug trafficking. But there's no group that calls itself the Cartel of the Suns. Yet they declared it a terrorist organization and said Maduro is its leader. And now they're saying that they're bombing so-called terrorists carrying drugs. So it's clear that this is they're marching towards some sort of regime change effort here. We don't know exactly what they're going to do. But, the drugs, if fentanyl and everything is what they're trying to solve, this has really nothing to do with it. And also Trump claimed that these were members of Tren de Aragua, which is a Venezuelan gang that has been active in the U.S. in the past couple of years, according to, law enforcement. And they claim Maduro's their leader, the leader of that gang too, which there's just no evidence for that. There was even a U.S. intelligence document that came out that said, it's unlikely that Maduro and the top government officials direct or they view this gang as a threat. And there's just so much lying and misrepresenting things going on here. So for the people saying, who even think we should take military action against cartels, they need to understand that that's not why this is happening. This has nothing to do with that, really. This current deployment in the Caribbean and blowing up this boat and whatever else is next here.
This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. You and I make decisions every day, but on Prize Picks, being right can get you paid. Don't miss any of the excitement this season on Prize Picks, where it's good to be right. It's easy to get started. You just choose more or less on player stat projections. If you pick right, you could cash in. Yeah, it's amazing, like how much they will just lie about these things. I was thinking, I didn't get a chance to make this point, but I was thinking, I was on Piers Morgan's show earlier today, and they were, they were talking about this, the military parade that they just had over in China, and kind of like a broader conversation about like the unipolar moment being over and stuff, which is a very interesting, topic. And at one point I was thinking to say, but there wasn't really a good hawk on the panel for me to argue with. But it's just like the thing just came into my head. It was just like, hey, remember when you guys were lying and saying that China was committing a genocide 5 years ago? Remember that? Remember, like this like came up for like a little bit. I even remember like even in like different like circles of libertarians or something, like they'd be like, oh, they denied the Uyghur genocide, and it was all literally just that Mike Pompeo told you so. Like Mike Pompeo just said it in 2020. His one source was that Adrian Zenz, who just like no opinion either way, just objectively just got the numbers wrong, like just didn't carry a 7 when he was supposed to, and like came to a completely wrong conclusion. And now that's not even a thing that they even use. Even when they're trying to ramp up, be hawkish on China, they don't even say that anymore. It's just like they lie, they move on, then it's whatever, then they come up with another excuse for it. But again, and this is to the point that you started with there, that it's like, this is where reading antiwar.com helps, is that whenever there's and just in general, whenever there's, I apologize, I'm having some work done in the house, and so if you hear some of that, I do apologize, guys. But whenever there is these conflicts come up, they've almost always been going on for a while, but everybody's not paying attention to them. It's a big advantage if you're me and you interview Scott Horton all the time. Scott Horton was talking about the Maidan Revolution on my podcast like for years before Vladimir Putin invaded the country, but no one's really paying attention to that. Then when Vladimir Putin invades, they all start spinning their propaganda. And like, it's a big advantage if you're like, oh, I've actually been paying attention to this since before you just started lying. And so what happens is that you realize that, like, even the way you just said it, it's like, look, I'll say this, there's a lot of people of good faith who really do just look around and see how many lives fentanyl has ruined, or how many ruined lives, then get more ruined by drug addiction and things like that. And there's definitely some people who I think are good people, like Cubans who moved to America, people who really hate communism, and like, because they understand firsthand how destructive and oppressive it is. And so these people like get sucked into this, but you're like, look, if the goal here was really to keep fentanyl out of the United States of America, why are we picking on Venezuela? Why does it happen to be the regime that you already wanted to overthrow now happens to be the target of this military strike? Like, I'm sorry. It's like when they said they wanted to fight the war in Ukraine to protect democracy or something like that. And you're like, wait a minute, if you're all about democracy, well, then why are you propping up the king of Jordan and the house of Saud? And this just doesn't pass the basic smell test. And so they manipulate people with this, like, oh, protecting democracy, that does sound like a noble enough goal. Hating communism, that sure does sound like a noble enough goal. But again, also, if you really hated communism, like at a certain point, wouldn't you go, we've run this playbook and it doesn't work. Like we've got with Fidel Castro right here, a few miles off of our coast. We had the toughest sanctions, multiple assassination, regime change attempts. It only made the people's support for that regime stronger. And of course, this is a point that I think only like us libertarians, the non-interventionist libertarian types, are really making. Maybe there's some other people outside of this, but like, can't you, like, as an American, almost understand that? Well, just think about how much right-wingers hated Joe Biden in this country. Like, just, thought the average right-winger in America thought that the election in 2020 was stolen, that Joe Biden was senile, that he was, the other shadowy pedophiles were really running the government and Joe Biden was just their fake. But like, if the Chinese came in and tried to overthrow Joe Biden, those same right-wingers would have grabbed their guns and taken to the streets to defend him, because screw that. You're not coming in here and telling us what we're allowed to do. Like, you don't get to just rule over us. That people, like, autonomy and sovereignty is something that matters to human beings. And so, of course, if you really cared about people dying of drug deaths, you would just call off the drug war. And if you really cared about, Venezuela becoming more capitalist, then you would want to just trade with them. It'd be the best move. I mean, they never try that, but that would be by far the best move.
Yeah, I mean, especially with Cuba too. Like you said, it's so close. Yeah. They've been under these sanctions since what, the 1960s? Same government still there. Like, what has it done? Like, how can you justify continuing this policy? And yeah, with the drug war, I mean, this is just like, I saw one report in the New York Times today, a U.S. official saying, there's going to be more of these attacks on these boats or whatever. Who knows what this could turn into? There's talk of launching like drone strikes in Mexico. But, turning the drug war, like they're combining the drug war and the war on terror. I mean, that's like literally what they're doing. Narco terrorists is the new thing. I mean, drug traffickers are not terrorists. Like, it's a different thing. But because they have this, I guess, whole machine built up, they're going to just try to use it against the drugs. And I mean, and to be clear, we don't really know exactly this boat that Trump bombed. There hasn't been any claims from the Venezuelan government that it like belonged to them or anything. Interesting to see how they're going to react. So we don't really know like what the next step is when it comes to the push for regime change or anything. But it seems like I really think a big part of this was setting a precedent, and they're trying to like kind of figure out what they're going to do with Venezuela. Because I mean, Maduro says, he's mobilized this big like pro-government militia that he claims that has millions of members. And I don't think the U.S. can do like a Noriega, like Panama style invasion and just take him out like that. So I think that they actually are, there was a report in Axios, I think I might have sent it to you, that said that like the Trump administration doesn't really know if this is like what they're going to do next here. And you have some officials saying that they might do an invasion. They might do a drone strike to take out Maduro. So we don't know where this is headed, but either way, it's a very dangerous direction. And then there's the other side of it. Like, are they going to start doing this in Mexico? There's reports that they might start launching drone strikes in Mexico against the will of the Mexican government. And I mean, where is this all going to lead? The fact that they think they could just bomb away this problem, I think, again, that also says a lot about the soul of our nation. Yeah. The fact that people think that, our friends and family are dying of drug overdoses, calling the military, calling the drone strikes. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of really sad to think about.
Yeah, I was so on my last yesterday on the show, I was which by the way got us a copyright strike. I guess I'm not allowed to use content from that Jubilee thing or whatever. I'll keep that in mind going forward. But I was we were trashing this communist like girl who was just making this, she was just making an argument about how like the communist position is that we should live in post scarcity, and then we were mocking how ridiculous that is. It's like, oh, is that your position? All wants and needs should be met. Hey, great, that's my position too, but like whatever. And I kept calling it infantile, and then I was thinking about this like last night as I was falling asleep. But I was like, so much of this stuff, it comes down to almost like a God complex. It's like, it's not just that you're like, and this is true, like kind of across the board. It's not a coincidence, by the way, that the commies are always atheists. And there's something about like when God is removed, that then people, it's like creates a vacuum, and then people and it's like a through line through like, look, all the crazy transgender stuff. It's like, what is that? Well, you're saying you can play the role of God? You can argue with biological reality? Like, no, you can't. What are you talking about? And the idea that you can abolish scarcity. What do you mean? That's the condition of man. I'm sorry, that's above all of our pay grade. That's somebody else's job to make that decision. And it does seem like there's something about that with whether you're talking about the war on terrorism or the war on drugs, and the idea that you think you have the power and the ability to dictate who puts what in their body or what government is in charge of what other group of people, when the objective it's Nancy Pelosi, who was on record a couple years ago saying we're going to take all Ukrainian territory back from Vladimir Putin, including Crimea. I mean, what is that other than like a disdain for the limits of reality? Like, no, you actually can't. And if I tell you, like, I got these big trees in my yard, and if I go, I'm going to take one of them down with my fist, and you go, I don't think you're going to be able to do that. Like, the conversation isn't about whether it's right or wrong for me to knock down a tree with my fist. The conversation is like, you do not have that ability. You will shatter your hand before you knock down this tree. And that does not seem to enter these conversations at all. That it's like, we're just not as, I think it was Harry Brown who came up with the line. It's always my favorite line about the war on drugs. But you go, that the federal government can't even keep drugs out of federal prisons. Like, the area that you have on lockdown is still riddled with drugs because your own guards are smuggling them in, and then or visitors are smuggling them in or whatever. And then, like, you have this the nerve to think that you can, by blowing up ships, you're going to stop Americans from demanding drugs. It's just so, it really is. There's something that it's like a God complex of some sort.
We're talking about fentanyl. Like, it's such a small, like, you need such a small amount. Like, they could smuggle that in so many different ways. And, you know, I like, one thing I like that you always bring up in your debates with like Zionists and stuff is like, you know, try to apply war to like a domestic situation. Like, if a killer had a shootout with the cops and ran into an apartment building, would anybody ever accept blowing the apartment building up? Or if there was a hostage situation and they just, you know, dropped the bomb on everybody, you know, none of us would ever accept that. And I mean, that's a similar thing here. Like, they claim these people on a boat are carrying drugs. What if they were like, you know, off the coast? What if they were in the Long Island Sound or something?
Right.
And they claim that they had drugs. Would anybody ever accept just blowing a boat out of the water and killing everybody on it because the government claimed that they were running drugs? And a lot of the people who are actually the ones transporting the drugs, they're not like the narcos. They're not the cartel leaders. A lot of them are just poor people just doing what they can to make money, or some of them are even forced into it. Like, you know, so it's really immoral in a lot of different ways. And I think it's good to try to put that in a domestic lens. Like, if someone was on your nearby lake in a boat and they said, oh, he's got cocaine, blow him up. I mean, especially when you have an armada, you have 8 warships in the area. The whole thing is just crazy. And what are they going to do, like in Mexico, in the border? Like, are they going to start blowing up cars that they claim are coming from cartel labs or something? You know, where's this going to go? And
and it's like the idea that you think also that, you know, like, it's like people's brain just stops there. Oh, we're gonna label, because this idea has been floated out and by people who I even kind of like. I mean, I like Vivek Ramaswamy, but this was one of his just like absolute worst ideas on the campaign trail, that we're going to declare that the drug cartels are terrorists, so then we can start drone bombing the drug cartels. It's like, okay, and then what? Like, play this, that's it? That's the end of the story? Now there's no more drug cartels and everything's good and there's no negative reaction that comes from that? Like, how about the level of just like how many innocent people are you going to kill while you're doing that? How much hatred is that going to now engender from our neighbor to the south? Anyone want to think about that for 5 minutes before we just declare war? Like, gee, I mean, it's just, you know, I was thinking about this also earlier and I didn't get to say any of this stuff on Pierre, so maybe I'll just say it now to you. But I was thinking about this, because as people were talking about, you know, like kind of the collapse of the unipolar moment, which probably ended a while ago, but they're now, China had a parade, and so now it's over. But
Trump could have went. I think he was invited.
Yeah, well, maybe that would have been a good idea. Got to deal with people, even people you're not friends with. But he has already met with Putin, and he's met with Kim Jong-un in the past, and he's met with Xi in the past. So like, yeah, it wouldn't have been like inconceivable for him to do that. But there was something. So I was thinking about this, and I've just heard this. And this is a little bit anecdotal, but I think this is right. Is that right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that like the Russians kind of had a favorable view of America, and that they were like, look, if you think about, you remember, Metallica went to Moscow, and they had like you ever seen like the videos of that concert?
Yeah,
1991. It's like, dude, they describe, there's so many people, Dave. They describe the amount of people there like you're talking about casualties from a huge war. They go, it's believed that 500,000 to 1.2 million people were there. Like, they don't even know how many people there, and they're just loving it. And that was the thing, right? And I always love bringing up the King Crane Commission, when they went to Syria and asked who they wanted to rule over them in a League of Nations mandate, and they overwhelmingly picked the United States of America, because before we started intervening in that part of the world, they had a favorable view of us. And the same with the Russians. It wasn't that they were going, hey, you guys did such a good job with the Cold War, or the war in Vietnam was really great that you guys fought that. It had nothing to do with none of that. They just saw our prosperity. They loved our blue jeans and rock and roll music. That's what they thought. And so, I don't know, there's just this thing I've been thinking about, that it's like the biggest lie ever told was George W. Bush and the neocons saying that they hate us for our freedom. But the inverse of it is what's actually correct, that people loved us for our freedom. That was actually the things they loved. And so this idea that like the way you're going to extinguish, socialism in South America, or even drug cartels or anything like that, is to use the force of government to go over there and start killing a bunch of people or impoverish a bunch of people. And that's what engenders hatred. That's what makes people hate you. Statism makes people hate you, and freedom makes people love you. It's the exact opposite of what the neocons always said.
Yeah, and when it comes to bombing the cartels, it's not like there's like a model of success to look at, because essentially, like what Vivek and others have said is like, oh, let's use this military machine we created for the terror wars against the cartels. It's like as if there's a successful model to do this off of. And then the other thing, when we talk about sanctions in Venezuela, I always remember when Biden was putting sanctions on Russia, and one of his lines was, oh, we turned the ruble into rubble, even though that wasn't true. The ruble bounced back pretty quick. But imagine if you're in Russia and all the Russian government has to do for their propaganda purposes is just like play that speech. Biden like bragging that he destroyed the Russian economy. Again, no matter what you think of your own government, if there's a foreign government saying that about your country, how are you going to respond? And as we saw a similar thing in Iran with they had the rally around the flag moment. And I saw even like US funded NGOs who are always very anti-Iranian government were like very against the bombing campaign. So it like made the regime stronger in a way. And I think we could see that with Venezuela, because Maduro, if you watch him, like his press conferences, he's always talking about the U.S. empires after him, this and that. And now we've deployed 7 warships, to the Venezuelan coast. And he's like, see what I've been talking about? Like the propaganda points for the governments that we target, just, we really help them out with that. There's just so many things like just foolhardy about this. And, this idea, like you said, it's like people just want to wish away fentanyl, just say, we got this military, why can't we use it against it? But it's just like, it's just going to create more problems here. And one thing, Seth Harp, he just wrote the book, The Fort Bragg Cartel, which I need to read, but he was on Tucker recently. And Tucker, who I think has supported the idea of military action against the cartels, asked him about it. And one thing he said, is that the cartels, like, it's not like how people picture them in movies or TV shows. Like the network that gets the drugs into our country is like a network of corrupt officials, and like in Mexico and in all of Latin America and the border people, like it's a whole it's not just like you could just target like a cartel leader and it's going to stop this. I mean, I don't get how people can even think that.
Yeah. And it's also just, the stuff with drugs particularly, and there's that one, there's the famous rat study where they so like there was this initial study that like was totally relied upon for all the drug all the war on drugs propaganda, all the just say no stuff. And basically they took like a rat and they had like 2 water bottles, and one was laced with cocaine and one was just water. And the rat would taste cocaine and then just drink the cocaine until he killed himself. And they were like, look, that's, you get one taste and you're hooked, and then you're going to kill yourself. And that's why you have to just say no. And we have to fight this whole war. And then there was like one scientist who looked at that and he was like, well, let's do some variables with this. Cause like, this is a pretty miserable experience for this rat who's just living in a cage, isolated by himself. So let's like give him everything he wants. So they built like this, like a big, almost like a little amusement park for a rat with all these toys, and they gave him other rats in there, and they gave him sexual partners and all this stuff, and then put the 2 water bottles in, and none of them killed themselves with it. They'd all just try the cocaine, have a little bit, and then go back. And I get just the point of it is that there's a deeper problem when people are ODing on drugs. There's just like a much deeper problem. It says something about what's going on with our society. I got little kids. I don't, you do too. The older the kids get, especially I've had so many examples of this before, but this is just the way it is, man. Like, you meet really nice people. Like my daughter's best friend, their parents are like just really great people. And their little girl's the sweetest little girl in the world. And then the one who's a problem in her class is like, their parents are a mess. It's like you see, and like there's just like these major problems that are much, much deeper than the substance. And you would think that like particularly right wingers who really seem to get this when it comes to guns, you know what I mean? That like this is goofy for you to blame the inanimate object. The problem is the person behind it who's willing to go.
It's like blowing up a Glock factory or something.
Yes, like this is not serious. This does not solve the problem. And you would think, what are we going on? 50 years of fighting a war on drugs? And now they're saying it's worse than ever. It's like, no, I think that might be your answer right there. Final word to you, Dave, and then let people know where they can go find your amazing work and support your stuff.
One thing, just about the war on drugs, I just wanted to say, I remember when I was a kid, I grew up on Long Island, and in the town I lived in, like drugs just like flooded in there when I was like high school age. And I remember when I was a kid, I smoked like cigar, like I would try to smoke tobacco, but I didn't touch cigarettes because I was like, oh, I'll get hooked in like a day. And then I remember an older kid said, you won't get hooked. That's not true. And I started smoking cigarettes, and I was like, I'm not addicted. And I said, and basically my thought was, well, what else can I try? I guess everything they're telling me is a lie. So it like led me on this path to like trying all these drugs. And now I have kids and I'm very against drugs and everything. I'm more Catholic than anything these days. I had like a big reversion to my faith. So I really do not like this stuff. And one of my best friends is dead because of it. So again, I get the sentiment, but unfortunately we can't just bomb this problem away. But anyway, so that's it, I guess. And go to antiwar.com/donate if you could help us with our fundraiser. As Dave Smith says, he relies on us for a lot of things. So if you appreciate him and our work and you could help us out, we really appreciate it. That's, again, how we get by. I really hate asking people for money, but it is necessary for what we do and what we want to continue to do. And also check out my show. If you're watching this on YouTube, go to Anti-War News and subscribe. I do like a daily show of all the news stories I write.
Yeah, it's an excellent show. Your articles at antiwar.com are always excellent. And yes, we'll make sure to put the link for the fundraiser in the show notes of the episode. Dave DeCamp, as always, thank you so much, brother. It's always great hearing from you. Thank you to everybody for watching. ComicDaveSmith.com. I'm on the road for the rest of the year, so come on out and see me and Robbie the Fire